You are watching DHTV from California State University, Dominguez Hills.
But what was very important with regards to the CIO was that it gave open arms to the immigrant, and most importantly, it represented previously excluded groups: African Americans, Mexicans, women, as well as immigrants. So, without the rank and file disruption of the CIO and the eventual organizing tactics that were institutionalized by the Congress of Industrial Organizations, we would not have what is known today as the Fair Labor Standards Act. And that act is very important because it is a federal statute of the United States. It was passed in 1938. Now, the FLSA established what we all take for granted today, and when we go apply for a job. We understand that the Fair Labor Standards Act established a national minimum wage. It established guaranteed time and a half for overtime, especially in certain jobs. And it prohibited most employment of minors in quote-unquote oppressive child labor. This is a term that is defined in the statute. It gave us the 40-hour week. We got the weekend. So again, labor organizing, the CIO brought us the weekend. So one of the things about the Fair Labor Standards Act is that it applies to employees engaged in interstate commerce or employed by an enterprise that is engaged in commerce or in the production of goods for commerce, unless the employer can claim an exemption from coverage. So the ultimate message of the Fair Labor Standards Act is that it is not necessarily your fault that you are poor. That was one of the most powerful messages that was brought out as a result of the New Deal. And the New Deal was very important. That generation left us a heritage that we need to appreciate. Now, on the other hand, there was going to be certain events that are going to be occurring in Europe and Russia that led to the rise of totalitarianism, what is known as totalitarianism of the left and totalitarianism of the right, that led the U.S. Congress to become reactionary and fearful. And so on May 26, 1938, the House Committee on Un-American Activities was established, and a special investigating committee was reorganized from its previous incarnations, and the idea was to investigate alleged disloyalty and subversive activities on the part of private citizens, public employees, and those organizations suspected of having both communist or fascist ties. This committee is going to work for the next 20 years, from 1938 through to 1960, to undermine the organizing activities of union leaders and workers, and this is the CIO, and then it would work to deport American citizens whose loyalty was called into question. And so we have this particular committee that's going to do tremendous damage to immigrant rights and going to do tremendous damage to organizing abilities. And as a result of this committee, there's going to be a reinforcement of their suspicions through the passage of what is known as the Smith Act, the Alien Registration Act, or the Smith Act of 1940, is a United States federal statute that set criminal penalties for advocating the overthrow of the U.S. government, and it required all non-citizen adult residents to register with the government. So the act, while it was set to, anybody who's going to be advocating the overthrow of the U.S. government, well, obviously there's some problems, but the act was designed to go against political organizations and figures, most notably those who were involved with the Communist Party and the Socialist Party in the United States. Approximately 250 Americans are going to be indicted under the terms of the legislation, including all alleged communists, socialists, Trotskyists, and fascists. Luisa Moreno will be deported under the provisions of this act. So you can imagine if we've had this act in operation today, then perhaps something would happen with regards to the presidential administration. Now, previously we had covered the repatriation of Mexicans during the Great Depression. Mexicans were the scapegoats for America's financial crisis. So in the 1930s, that Mexican generation, that generation's experience with labor recruitment and then deportation is very crucial to understand because it reveals the cycles of change that will continue to the present day. And so I had asked you to remember something about these cycles of change, that whenever there are economic labor necessities in the United States, the remedy becomes Mexican migration. And Mexican migration stimulates a movement of people to the United States. This is the cycle of change, because ultimately, with regards to Mexicans, the notion is the United States can't live with them, and of course, they can't live without them. So whenever there are economic labor necessities in the United States, the remedy becomes Mexican migration, which stimulates a movement of people to the United States. When those labor needs are satisfied, there oftentimes occurs an economic downturn, which results in immigration restriction and deportation. Now, this process occurs again when the United States is in need of labor. So it's important to understand this cycle because it occurs numerous times in the 20th century. Now, today's controversy is but a reflection of this historical cycle. What Trump is mouthing off, what this administration is doing with regards to the immigrant experience and the Mexican immigrant, it's nothing new. It is not anything new. It is a part of an experience of every generation of Mexicanos that have been living in the United States since the U.S. takeover. And so, for Mexicanos, it must be faced. For Chicanos, it must be faced. American society has this inborn hatred for things Mexican. And it stems from the war. It began with the U.S. war with Mexico in 1846, of which the United States refuses to take a look at. And it continues to this day, especially along the border that was created by this war. So we can see this cycle appear again in the form of what would be known as the Bracero Program and then Operation Wetback. So let's start with the Bracero Program. As World War II commenced, the labor market structure changed as the federal government took over the economy. Individual growers were increasingly monopolizing the market as they moved into what became known as agribusiness. The growers had a problem. How do you maintain cheap labor forces at peak harvest periods during the war? See, many native Mexicano farm workers were drafted, or they were attracted to urban areas where higher paying industrial jobs proliferated. As we will see, the relocation of Japanese to concentration camps likewise is going to create a gap in the labor force in agriculture. So the farmers were in a dilemma. Are they going to lose crops and profits due to labor shortages? Or they're going to increase wages to attract workers, which of course, for any capitalist, you increase the wages, they immediately react because it's going to increase or it's going to decrease their profits. It's going to cut into their profits. But meanwhile, the federal government is putting pressure on agribusiness for more production for the war effort. So the growers are going to respond by putting pressure on the federal government for a plan. The United States is going to turn to Mexico to fulfill the economic need. So of course, in the 1930s, after deporting Mexicans en masse, the United States government is going to go to Mexico and ask, can we borrow those workers? Can we borrow those workers? So in the 1930s, the U.S. is deporting over 1 million. Now, in the 1940s, the United States comes back to Mexico and says, can you bring them back? So the plan called for a regulated immigration policy. It was a contracted form of migration. So the Bracero Program was a result of a plan by growers at the federal level in conjunction with Mexican officials. It was a plan that was funded by American taxpayers. agribusiness became subsidized by the federal government. And it became known as Public Law 45, and it was passed in 1943. It was a bilateral, binational agreement. It was to be a temporary program. It was only supposed to be used when in need of labor. It was to end when the war was over. Mexican workers were not to displace domestic workers. Mexican workers were exempt from military service. Mexican workers were not to be, get this, they were not to be discriminated against. So there is a documentary produced by one of our professors here at Dominguez Hills, Vivian Price, and it is a documentary on the Bracero program, and it was entitled Harvest of Loneliness. It is a film that is required viewing for this class, especially for this segment. And so we're going to go and we're going to take a series of clips and put them together so that we can appreciate the Bracero program. And what's going to happen is this program became so lucrative because you had a captured labor force that this program is going to continue beyond World War II all the way into the 1960s until the civil rights movement is going to begin to question this particular program. So let's go to the series of film clips.
This is Salvador Ballesteros, 40 years old, a bracero. At home in northern Mexico, he earns about $200 a year farming 2 acres of cotton owned by someone else. $200 to support a wife and 6 children. Even in Mexico, this is not much. It is Salvador's dream for himself and for his children to own a piece of land. To buy land, he must earn more money doing the only thing he knows how to do, farming. And the only way he can do this is to work in the United States as a bracero.
It began in 1942, just as preparations for war were gearing up and a manpower shortage was declared. A bunch of administrative agencies came together, met independently, and hammered out some agreements with Mexican officials.
The workers not involved to bring workers because of the war effort. Well, we never got rid of the program until 1964. The war ended and they continued bringing in as many as 500,000. Depressed the wages, kept the unions out. And what I'm saying is that this is what they do, and they're very good at it.
There may have been a shortage during World War II because you can understand logically that there might be. There are also strikes going on and unions being formed and other reasons why growers might want to have a bracero workforce.
En California hubo una lucha de trabajadores agrícolas. Esa fue una lucha que no surgió en los 60s. Una lucha histórica que venía desde los 30s, desde los 20s. Toda una lucha que venía acumulándose. En la etapa más difícil de esa lucha fue el programa Bracero, porque entonces no prosperaban las huelgas, no había forma de sindicalización.
They've been able to maintain what they call a surplus labor pool, more workers than jobs. That's been the hit of agribusiness in the United States.
And it became perfectly clear that what was really wanted was a very cheap, very predictable, and very captive workforce. And these were qualities that the Bracero program supplied. There was a shortage of that type of workforce.
At its peak, which was about 1957, nearly 500,000 men were contracted in a single year. And during the entire course of the program, at least 5 million men were involved. It was a massive population movement, which, in my opinion, never received the attention that it merited. It was one of the largest population movements in the world at that time.
La gente que estaba ya legal aquí en los Estados Unidos, los tenían separados de uno. No vivían juntos, de uno sí, toda la raza junta, pero esas personas ya les tenían su casa o qué sé yo, aparte del trabajo sí andábamos todos juntos, pero en las tardes que salía uno de esos, ellos ya se iban a su casa, no estaban revueltos con uno de bracero. Pues casi la mayoría de las personas eran mayordomos. Un mayordomo se llevaba que 20 o 30, porque había campos que habíamos hasta 500 o 1000 personas, como ese de Arizona. Nomás en el puro riego, nada más regando, habíamos 180 regadores. Habíamos miles de gentes ahí. Había 2 turnos, empezaba uno a las 5 de la mañana y salía a las 5 de la tarde de ese grupo y entraba otro de las 5 de la tarde a las 5 de la mañana, toda la noche. Y a mí me tocó casi todo el tiempo de noche. Pues era duro, trabajar 12 horas puro de noche, estaba todo.
From Empalme, they were brought in on a train. People would get off of the train, naturally, board a bus. And there was an opening back here where the bus would park and the people would come across. So when they got over here, they were in very dire conditions, health-wise.
Llegamos nosotros Ciudad Juárez, ya nos bajaron, llegamos al puente, nos formaban y estaba solo el salón y allí nos metieron a todos, ahí nos desnudaron, ahí nos afocaron las máquinas para fumigarnos con polvo de avión, con insecticida, a todos sin saber si nos quedábamos ciegos o no. En la cabeza cantidad de polvo.
Hasta me mareé yo, me acuerdo de cada vez que me usaban esas cosas. Y pues está fuerte, toda la ropa estaba hasta caliente cuando la ponía uno.
There was about 7 of us that were hired out of high school, so I had to have been 16, 17. This sounds horrible, but they had to be fumigated.
At the border, individuality disappears in a cloud of DDT dust.
Yeah, I did that for 3 days, and then I said, no, I can't do this anymore because it was degrading to the people. And then, there were some that had all their clothing and etc. very neatly stacked, and you had to ruffle through it and spray it, and that was a bad deal.
For perhaps the first time in his life, he gets a thorough physical examination, partly for his protection and partly to make sure his American employer will get his money's worth.
It was very degrading. You have to remember that this is a captive group. You're going to do what you do with them, and they have no say-so.
Había médicos que estos 2 dedos nos los metían en los testículos. No crea que con modo, no, así. Que había muchas gentes que se desmayaban. En piquete así, nada más.
They had blood drawn. They were given an X-ray. They were giving a very cursory examination of the tonsils and the teeth.
Teníamos que estar como si fuéramos caballos para la venta. Que tuviéramos salir.
Estaba malo regresado para atrás.
Yo nunca había pasado por eso. Yo estaba muy asustado, con mucha pena, ¿verdad? Que me daba a mí. Porque a mí nunca me había pasado eso allá. Ni con doctor lo habíamos hecho. Y aquí fue la primera vez que me pasó eso.
Y luego se enfrentaban a un sistema burocrático que ni conocían. Por eso en las micas de los braceros, cuando ve uno las fotos, decía, caray, ¿por qué ni siquiera se peinaban para retratarse? Pues estaban hasta asustados, ¿verdad? Le decían, Antonio, pásale para acá. Y se asomaba por la ventana, le ponían un número y lo retrataban. Y salía asustado, así cansado, hambriento.
The first time that I actually visited the reception center, the manager of the center said it would be okay for me to go into the hall where the selecting, as they called it, was going on that day. The fellow representing some growers association up in Northern California was happy enough to have me stand by his side while he demonstrated the way he did his so-called selecting. Well, there were these hundreds of men lined up outside, and they would shuffle past this guy who commented on why he was selecting one guy and rejecting another guy. And it all had to do with whether they measured up to his criteria for what he considered to be a good bracero. These had to be men who were apparently timid, docile, unlettered, impoverished. Anybody who was well-dressed or well-spoken would be rejected.
El centro California, el corralón, le decía, ¿no? Allí estaba toda la raza, una comparación como si allí hubiera encerrado un montón de bueyes, por decirlo así, discúlpenme la palabra, porque allí llegaban rancheros, ¿no? De compañías de particulares, que yo quiero 18 gente, que yo quiero 20, y pasaban de allá al corralón, a ver.
I found it unspeakably appalling. I thought that it must be something like this in the slave markets of Charleston or New Orleans or Baltimore or wherever they were selecting in those days.
Dice, a unos nos humillaban muy feo. Nos veían casi como a los negros cuando los tenían de esclavos, así casi una comparación con otra.
It was followed up by a standard work contract, which every bracero received in Spanish and in English. There were guarantees of quality housing, safe and comfortable transportation, insurance, both on and off the job, covering workers against injuries and illnesses. But in actual practice, almost all of these apparent protections were widely violated.
Now, this program is carried out under law. In some respects, I don't know of a labor regime anywhere in the world that on paper looks more attractive.
Hubo muchísimos braceros que se enfermaron o se accidentaron en los Estados Unidos y nunca nadie se preocupó por ellos. Muchos regresaron a México incapacitados, ya no pudieron tener una vida productiva y nunca nadie.
Okay, so we can understand that the U.S. federal government supports both corporate and business needs for inexpensive workers and high profits. The resounding theme, as expressed by the Bracero programs, is the federal government ensures people without rights for business. Now, the United States practices exclusionary citizenship. And we can see this through the Bracero program. Now, after the war, the need for a docile and unorganizable labor force did not diminish. Now, debates are going to increase after the war on the continued funding of this particular program. And then the Korean War breaks out in 1950, and the Korean War ensured the program's existence. Public Law 78 extended the program indefinitely. Now, in the 1950s, what's important to understand is that California had tremendous amounts of migrant farm workers, Filipinos, Mexicans, and poor whites, that they were struggling in the 1930s to organize into unions to improve their lot in the fields. The growers, by the 1940s and 50s, are going to begin to realize that the Bracero program can be used as a weapon against those citizens those who were already here, those immigrants who were already here trying to organize into unions. Growers, what would happen, would claim a labor shortage when workers struck, and they would request the importation of braceros. So what's going to happen is that the growers had always benefited from using undocumented workers. So eventually what's going to happen is that the federal government has to convince growers to embrace the Bracero program, and that will occur during the McCarthyite atmosphere of the 1950s, which was known as the Second Red Scare, and it's going to influence the federal government to support the growers by implementing a program called Operation Wetback. Now, Ernesto Galarza, in his seminal work, Merchants of Labor, is going to create a program called Operation Wetback. Ernesto Galarza, in his seminal work, Merchants of Labor, is going to reveal that in California, as Mexicans who organized in the fields were rounded up and deported, braceros came in to take their place. So what Operation Wetback, it was a federal policy that was designed to aid growers, but also to convince them to use the Bracero program. And so growers became convinced they could go ahead and deport Mexican union organizers and replace undocumented workers with braceros. So it forced growers to hire braceros. not undocumented workers. So this proved fruitful until the 1960s when the United Farm Workers exposed the program for what it was, the Bracero program. It was a federally designed program to provide cheap labor and deport those involved in unionization efforts. It was known as the guest worker program. Now let's take a look at a contemporary immigrant rights activist interpret the federal government's film on Operation Wetback. The government sponsored a film that fed the hysteria in the 1950s. And so racial and cultural bigots today are going to use this federal footage to stir up hatred. But in this particular case, there's the federal footage that's used by an immigrant rights activist. Let's go to Operation Wetback. All right, that was Galindo Productions, but I just thought I'd do that because of the dramatization, especially with regards to that person that's in the White House today. Now, you have to understand, again, Mexicans, you can't live with them. Mexicans, you can't live without them. The United States needs Mexican workers, but they just don't want them around in the neighborhood. Why can't they just come into work and then just leave because we don't want to see them? And that's been the Mexican experience throughout when the United States, after all, took over Nuestra Señora cerca del Río Porciúncula, La Reina, Los Angeles, or this place called Los Angeles. So you know when the American first came over and he started wanting to know how to pronounce this place, and the Mexicans telling them, hey, you know, Nuestra Señora cerca del Río Porciúncula, La Reina, Los Angeles, and they're going, what, Los Angeles? As no, Los Angeles. What, Los Angeles? So you know that the American and the Mexican, they're arguing over how to pronounce this place called Los Angeles, until a Tongva shows up and says, hey, both you're wrong, it's LA.